At 1400 hours on September 17, 1944, Staff Sergeant Thomas Kovac stood in the door of a C-47 transport aircraft 800 feet above Grosbeek, Holland, holding an M1 Carbine that violated every regulation in the Army Technical Manual. 28 years old. 1st Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. 6 modified magazines strapped to his web gear. 110 rounds total, every magazine containing double the number of springs Army Ordnance specified. Every magazine capable of feeding reliably under conditions that killed other paratroopers. The red light above the door glowed in the dimness of the aircraft cabin. 17 paratroopers stood behind Kovac, hooked to the static line, waiting. Through the open door, German 88mm flak burst in black puffs against the afternoon sky. The C-47 shuddered. Metal fragments pinged against the fuselage. Green light. Kovac jumped. 4 seconds of freefall. The parachute opened with a shock that drove breath from his lungs. He looked down. Beet fields. Tree line 300 yards east. Muzzle flashes from the tree line. Germans. Squad strength, maybe more. Kovac hit the ground hard, rolled, shrugged out of his parachute harness in 8 seconds. Bullets snapped overhead. He unslung the M1 Carbine, chambered a round from the modified magazine, turned toward the tree line. 3-round burst. The weapon fed perfectly. Another burst. The magazine spring pushed rounds into the chamber with 18 pounds of pressure. Enough to overcome dirt from the hard landing. Enough to overcome the mud already coating the feed lips. 15 rounds expended. Kovac dropped the magazine, inserted a second modified magazine. Kept firing. 12 more rounds, still no malfunction. Other paratroopers landed around him, some in the open field, some tangled in trees. Germans in the tree line kept firing. An MG-42 opened up, distinctive 1,200 rounds per minute rate, the sound like tearing canvas. Kovac moved toward a drainage ditch, firing as he moved. The modified magazine fed every round. No hesitation, no clicks, just reliable, sustained fire from a weapon that shouldn't work this well but did because 3 days earlier, Kovac had done something unauthorized. He'd fixed it. 3 months earlier, this same weapon type had killed his best friend by refusing to fire. The M1 Carbine was supposed to solve everything. Light. 7 pounds loaded versus 11 pounds for the M1 Garand. Compact. 3 feet overall length versus 43 inches for the Garand. 15-round detachable magazine versus the Garand's 8-round unblocked clip. Perfect for paratroopers who needed to carry everything they owned through an aircraft door at 800 feet. The 82nd Airborne received M1 Carbines in late 1942. Initial testing at Fort Benning showed excellent reliability. Paratroopers loved them. You could fire 15 rounds without reloading. You could carry 60 rounds of .30 carbine ammunition for the same weight as 48 rounds of Vabas 30 Sedan 06. The math worked. But the math only worked on the firing range. In combat, the M1 Carbine had one fatal problem that was killing American paratroopers from Normandy to the Netherlands. The magazine spring tension was wrong for field conditions. The magazine used a single coil spring to feed rounds upward into the chamber. Army Ordnance specification called for 14 pounds of compression force when new. That worked perfectly in Georgia. Clean weapons, fresh magazines, controlled temperature, no mud, no sustained firing, no 2 months of continuous field exposure. But in combat, everything changed. Dirt got into the magazine feed lips. Mud clogged the spring housing. Moisture caused rust on the spring coils. Repeated compression from loading and unloading weakened the spring's temper. After 60 days in the field, Magazine spring tension degraded from 14 pounds to 9 or 10 pounds. 9 pounds wasn't enough. Not enough to reliably push rounds into the chamber against dirt. Not enough to overcome carbon buildup on the feed ramp. Not enough to function when a paratrooper's life depended on the weapon firing immediately. By September 1944, the 82nd Airborne had documented 47 incidents of M1 Carbine magazine failures during critical combat engagements. 47 moments when paratroopers pulled triggers and got clicks instead of shots. 47 weapons malfunction reports filed through proper channels. Some of those 47 paratroopers survived their malfunctions, cleared the jam, got their weapons running, lived to fight another day. Some didn't. Some died with fully loaded magazines and weapons that wouldn't fire. Private First Class Danny Morrison was one of them. Thomas Kovac grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where his father worked the steel mills and came home every night smelling like furnace smoke and metal dust. Kovac learned early that survival meant understanding how things worked. Machines, tools, the physics of stress and failure. He enlisted in March 1942, age 26. Older than most recruits. He'd spent 8 years working as a machinist, understanding tolerances and spring tension and what happened when components degraded under load. Volunteered for paratroopers. Everyone said he was crazy. You're 26 years old, too old to be jumping out of airplanes. Get a safe assignment. Work in a motor pool. Use your machinist skills. Kovac went to Fort Benning anyway. Completed jump school. Got assigned to the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. By June 1944, he was a staff sergeant and squad leader. 9 men who trusted him to keep them alive through preparation and competence, not luck. Kovac's approach to leadership was methodical. Every morning, he field-stripped and inspected every weapon in his squad, checked bolt wear, examined firing pins, measured trigger pull, found problems before they became fatal. His men respected him because he didn't accept "that's just how it is" as an explanation for equipment failure. If something didn't work correctly, Kovac figured out why and fixed it. On the morning of June 7, 1944, Kovac couldn't fix what happened to Danny Morrison fast enough to save him. June 7th, 1944, 0830 hours, hedgerow country near Sainte-Mère-Église, Normandy. Kovac's squad was clearing German positions, moving through the Norman hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress. Ancient earthen berms topped with thick vegetation. Perfect defensive terrain. Germans used them well. Private First Class Danny Morrison was Kovac's assistant squad leader, 20 years old, Chicago. Worked as a mechanic before the war. He and Kovac had trained together at Benning, jumped together on D-Day, survived the chaos of the Normandy drop when half the regiment landed miles from their drop zones. Morrison was good, careful, professional. The kind of soldier who checked his equipment twice and kept his weapon clean even when everyone else was too exhausted to care. The squad encountered a German MG-42 position dug into a hedgerow 200 yards ahead. Kovac saw it first. Told Morrison to take 3 men and flank left while Kovac provided suppressive fire with his M1 Garand. Standard tactics: fire and movement. Keep the enemy's heads down while your element maneuvers. Kovac fired. 8 rounds from his Garand, methodical, aimed shots into the German position. The MG-42 stopped firing. Germans took cover. Morrison moved left with 3 paratroopers, used the hedgerows for concealment, got within 50 yards of the German position. Perfect angle, perfect opportunity. Morrison stood to engage the Germans from their flank. He aimed his M1 Carbine at the MG-42 crew. Pulled the trigger. Magazine failure. The feed lips were clogged with Norman mud, thick clay that got into everything. The magazine spring, already weakened from 2 weeks of field use, couldn't generate enough pressure to push the next round past the debris. Morrison tried to clear the malfunction, dropped the magazine, reached for a fresh one. The German MG-42 gunners saw him, standing, exposed. 3 seconds, 7.92 millimeter rounds hit Morrison in the chest and throat. He fell backward into the hedgerow vegetation. The M1 Carbine dropped from his hands. Kovac saw it happen. Wrong angle to provide covering fire. Wrong position to help. Could only watch Morrison go down. It took 3 hours to secure the German position and reach Morrison's body. Morrison was still holding the M1 Carbine when Kovac found him. The magazine was on the ground beside him, fully loaded. 15 rounds of .30 carbine ammunition. Morrison had died trying to reload a weapon that should have fired, but didn't. Kovac picked up the magazine, examined it, pressed the follower down with his thumb, felt the resistance. Maybe 9 pounds of spring tension. Not 14. Not enough. The feed lips were packed with mud and grass stems. A properly tensioned spring would have pushed rounds past that debris. Morrison's degraded spring couldn't. The problem wasn't the shooter. Morrison had done everything right. Kept his weapon as clean as possible under field conditions. Carried his magazines properly. Followed procedures. The problem was the spring. Kovac knelt beside Morrison's body for a long time. Thought about 14 pounds versus 9 pounds. Thought about the difference between a weapon that fires and a weapon that clicks. Thought about 5 pounds of spring tension being the difference between life and death. He made a decision that evening while helping bury Morrison in a temporary grave near the hedgerow where he fell. This problem was unacceptable. No more paratroopers would die because their magazines wouldn't feed. Not in his squad. Not if he could prevent it. Kovac kept Morrison's magazines, took them back to his bivouac area, started studying them. Between June and August 1944, during the Normandy campaign and the period between combat operations, Kovac collected failed magazines from other paratroopers, built a sample set of 18 magazines that had experienced malfunctions. He tested each one, pressed the follower, estimated compression force by hand, found a consistent pattern. Every failed magazine had spring tension degraded to between 8 and 11 pounds. Every one, no exceptions. Kovac compared them to new magazines from supply. Fresh magazines measured 14 pounds, fed perfectly, worked exactly as designed. But those new magazines also degraded. Kovac tracked them. After 30 to 40 days of field exposure, even the new magazines showed reduced spring tension. The single-coil spring design had no redundancy. Moisture got into the magazine body. Repeated compressions from loading and unloading caused permanent spring deformation. The steel lost its temper. Kovac requested replacement springs through proper channels. Filed equipment request forms. Went through his platoon sergeant, who went through the company supply sergeant, who went through battalion supply. Request denied. Replacement magazine springs unavailable. Low supply priority. Supply chains were focused on ammunition, rations, medical supplies. Small replacement parts like magazine springs weren't reaching frontline units. Army Ordnance Department's position was clear. The problem wasn't the equipment design. The problem was maintenance. Soldiers needed to clean their weapons more frequently. Keep magazines dry, avoid contamination. But Kovac knew that position was wrong. You can't keep magazines dry in Normandy in June. It rains constantly. You're lying in muddy foxholes. You're crossing rivers. You're moving through wet grass and flooded fields. You can't clean a magazine spring in combat. You can barely clean the weapon itself. You get maybe 5 minutes between firefights to wipe down the bolt and check the chamber. No time to disassemble magazines and clean internal components. The Army Ordnance Position assumed peacetime conditions, garrison duty, time for proper maintenance. Combat wasn't peacetime. Combat was mud and rain and sustained firing and equipment that either worked or got you killed. Kovac needed a solution that worked in combat conditions, not on a firing range in Georgia. He thought about it for weeks, studied the magazine design, considered the physics, drew on his machinist training. The realization came on September 14, 1944, in a staging area in England, 3 days before the Market Garden jump. If one spring provided 14 pounds when new but degraded to 9 pounds after field use, 2 springs would provide 18 pounds even after degradation. The concept was simple. The execution would require violating every specification in the Army Technical Manual. Kovac didn't care about specifications anymore. He cared about firepower. He cared about paratroopers who deserved weapons that worked when they pulled the trigger. Because in 72 hours, he'd be jumping into Holland with 9 men depending on him. And he refused to watch another Morrison die with a loaded magazine in a weapon that wouldn't fire. September 14th, 1944. 2100 hours. 82nd Airborne staging area, southern England. Kovac sat alone in the barracks. Morrison's magazine spread across the wooden table in front of him. Outside, other paratroopers played cards, wrote letters home, cleaned weapons. The usual pre-jump routine. Men preparing for Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne assault in history. Kovac wasn't playing cards. He was staring at 6 M1 Carbine magazines and thinking about spring mechanics. His machinist training covered this. Spring design, load distribution, compression characteristics. The physics were straightforward. A coil spring's force output depended on wire diameter, coil count, material properties, and compression distance. The M1 Carbine magazine spring was a single coil design. 1 spring, 14 pounds of force when manufactured to specification. But specifications assumed ideal conditions. No corrosion, no fatigue, no permanent deformation from repeated loading cycles. Real-world conditions weren't ideal. Kovac picked up one of Morrison's magazines, removed the floor plate. The spring slid out into his palm. He examined it under the barracks light. Slight rust on 3 coils. Permanent compression visible where the spring had been stored, loaded for weeks. The steel had lost its temper. He pressed the spring between his hands, estimated 9 pounds of resistance. Maybe 10. Not enough. The question was simple. How do you increase spring tension when replacement springs don't exist? Answer 1. Stretch the existing spring to increase coil tension. That would add maybe 2 pounds. Better than nothing. Still not enough for reliable feeding under combat conditions. Answer 2. Use 2 springs instead of 1. Kovac looked at the magazine body, measured the internal space with his fingers. The follower had vertical travel of approximately 4 inches when the magazine was empty. A single compressed spring occupied maybe 2 inches of that space. 2 springs, properly installed, would fit. Barely. But they would fit. The force would be additive. 2 14-pound springs would provide 28 pounds when new. Even after degradation to 9 pounds each, total force would still be 18 pounds. More than enough to overcome dirt, mud, carbon buildup. The concept worked mathematically. The question was whether it worked physically. Kovac pulled a second magazine from his collection, disassembled it completely, removed the follower, spring, and floor plate. Now he had 2 springs. He stretched the first spring manually. pulled the coils apart slightly to increase tension, added approximately 2 pounds of compression force, did the same with the second spring. Then he attempted to install both springs into a single magazine. The first spring went in easily, seated properly against the floor plate. The second spring had to nest inside the first spring's coils. Kovac compressed both springs simultaneously, aligned the follower, held everything in place while he reinstalled the floor plate. It was difficult. Required 3 attempts. The springs wanted to bind, wanted to twist sideways. But on the third attempt, everything aligned. Kovac released the compressed springs slowly. The follower rose with significantly more force than a standard magazine. He pressed it down with his thumb, estimated 18 to 20 pounds of resistance, maybe more. He loaded 15 rounds of .30 carbine ammunition into the modified magazine. The doubled springs pushed the rounds upward with enough force that inserting the last 3 rounds required real effort. Good. That meant feeding pressure would be high enough to overcome any debris that got into the mechanism. Kovac inserted the modified magazine into his M1 Carbine, chambered a round manually, felt the resistance. The bolt had to work against the increased spring pressure, but it chambered smoothly. No binding, no excessive resistance. He removed the magazine, inspected the feed angle. The rounds were positioned correctly. The doubled springs didn't alter the geometry. The modification worked. In theory. Theory wasn't enough. Kovac needed field testing. September 15th, 1944. 0600 hours. Kovac walked to the firing range at the edge of the staging area. Brought his modified magazine and 3 standard magazines for comparison. 30 rounds of ammunition. The range officer, a lieutenant from 2nd Battalion, asked what he was doing. "Testing magazine, reliability," Kovac said. The lieutenant nodded. Let him proceed. Pre-jump weapon testing was encouraged. Better to find problems in England than over Holland. Kovac loaded the modified magazine. 15 rounds, inserted it into his carbine. Fired 30 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger and reload. 15 rounds from the modified magazine. Reload. 15 more rounds from a second modified magazine that he'd prepared the previous night. 0 malfunctions. The weapon fed perfectly. Ejection was positive. The increased spring pressure pushed rounds into the chamber with enough force that feeding was actually faster than standard magazines. Kovac didn't clean the weapon. Deliberately. He wanted to test the modification under degraded conditions. He loaded a standard unmodified magazine, fired 15 rounds, reloaded, fired another 15. At round 23, the carbine clicked. Malfunction, failure to feed. Kovac cleared it, continued firing. At round 28, another malfunction. Same failure mode. The weakened spring in the standard magazine couldn't push rounds past the carbon buildup in the chamber. The comparison was clear. Modified magazines fed reliably even without cleaning. Standard magazines failed after 30 rounds of sustained firing. Kovac returned to the barracks. Spent the next 12 hours modifying 5 more magazines. Disassembled each one. Removed springs. Stretched them individually to increase base tension. Paired them by similar compression characteristics. Installed 2 springs per magazine. By midnight on September 15th, Kovac had 6 modified magazines. 90 rounds total capacity counting the magazine in his weapon. Every magazine tested. Every magazine functional. He also modified 6 magazines for Corporal James Mitchell, his assistant squad leader. Mitchell had asked about the modification after watching Kovac's range test. 23 years old, Texas. Practical like Kovac. Understood that survival required working equipment, not strict adherence to regulations that got men killed. Mitchell tested his modified magazines on September 16th. Same results. 0 malfunctions. Reliable feeding under rapid fire conditions. Word spread quietly through 1st Battalion. Some paratroopers asked Kovac how to modify their magazines. He showed them, explained the disassembly procedure, demonstrated spring stretching and installation. Others refused. Too risky. Too far outside regulations. What if the modification damaged the weapon? What if it caused catastrophic failure during combat? What if they got court-martialed for unauthorized weapon modifications? Kovac understood their concerns. The modification violated Army technical specifications, used non-standard components, could theoretically void the weapon's service guarantee. But Morrison had followed regulations, kept his weapon within specifications, died anyway because his magazine spring didn't have enough tension to overcome Norman mud. Kovac would take court-martial risk over combat death risk. September 16, 1944, 1400 hours. Technical Sergeant Bill Hayes, the company armorer, found Kovac in the barracks modifying magazines for 3 other paratroopers. Hayes was career Army, 15 years service, expert on small arms, responsible for ensuring all weapons in the company met Army specifications and functioned properly. He watched Kovac work for 2 minutes without speaking, watched him disassemble magazines, stretch springs, install doubled components. Then Hayes said, "That's unauthorized modification of issued equipment." Kovac looked up. "Yes, Sergeant." "Violates technical manual specifications." "Yes, Sergeant." "Could result in disciplinary action." "Yes, Sergeant." Hayes pulled out a chair, sat down across from Kovac. "Show me how it works." Kovac demonstrated, explained the spring tension problem, showed Hayes the comparison between modified and standard magazines, described Morrison's death and the 47 documented magazine failures. Hayes listened without interrupting. When Kovac finished, Hayes picked up a modified magazine, tested the follower pressure with his thumb, loaded 15 rounds, inserted the magazine into a carbine and chambered a round. "Feed angle looks correct," Hayes said. "No binding on the bolt carrier." "Tested it with 300 rounds," Kovac said. "0 malfunctions." Hayes removed the magazine, examined the spring installation. "You're using 2 springs instead of 1. Provides 18 pounds of pressure even after field degradation. Standard single spring drops to 9 pounds after 60 days. "I'm aware of the spring degradation issue," Hayes said. "Reported it to Battalion 3 months ago. Requested replacement springs. Request denied." "So you know the problem exists." "I know the problem exists," Hayes confirmed. "I also know that soldiers are dying because their magazines won't feed. And I know that Army ordnance isn't fixing it fast enough." Kovac waited. Hayes had the authority to confiscate the modified magazines. Could bring Kovac up on charges for unauthorized modifications. Could end this before Market Garden even started. Hayes stood, handed the modified magazine back to Kovac. "I didn't see anything," Hayes said. "But if you get men killed because your magazines explode or cause weapon failure, I'll testify at your court-martial that you were warned." "Understood, Sergeant." "How many magazines have you modified?" 12 so far. 6 for me, 6 for Corporal Mitchell." "You have enough springs for more?" Kovac shook his head. "I'm using springs from damaged magazines. Limited supply." Hayes nodded, walked toward the door, stopped, turned back. "There's a crate in the supply tent," Hayes said. "Damaged magazines, awaiting depot repair. Maybe 50 magazines total. Most have broken feed lips or cracked bodies, but the springs are salvageable." "How would someone access that crate?" "Supply tent isn't locked during the day. Anyone could walk in." Hayes left. Kovac waited 30 minutes, then walked to the supply tent, found the crate Hayes mentioned. pulled 20 springs from magazines too damaged for field use, but with functional spring components. By midnight on September 16th, Kovac had enough springs to modify 30 magazines total. He worked through the night. Other paratroopers helped. Mitchell showed men from 2nd Squad how to stretch springs and install them properly. Private Eddie Walsh, the squad's bar gunner, modified magazines for his fire team. By dawn on September 17th, 47 paratroopers in 1st Battalion had modified magazines. The modification was spreading through informal networks. Soldier to soldier, squad to squad. No official documentation, no engineering approval, just combat results and men who refused to die because Army ordnance couldn't deliver replacement springs. September 17th, 1944. 0600 hours. Final equipment inspection before the Market Garden jump. Kovac stood in formation with his squad. 9 men. Full combat load. Weapons, ammunition, rations, medical supplies. Everything they'd need to fight in Holland for 72 hours until ground forces linked up. Private First Class Eddie Walsh, 19 years old, Boston, carried a Browning automatic rifle. 20 pounds of weapon plus 600 rounds of ammunition. Private Henry Hank Chen, 21, San Francisco rifleman, carried an M1 Garand. 48 rounds, 30.06. Private Robert Sullivan, 20, Detroit, assistant BR gunner, carried an M1 Garand plus extra BR magazines. Corporal James Mitchell, 23, Texas, assistant squad leader, carried an M1 Carbine with 6 modified magazines, 90 rounds total. 4 other riflemen, all carrying M1 Garands. Standard 8-round unblocked clips. Kovac carried his M1 Carbine with 6 modified magazines, plus his backup M1 Garand with 48 rounds. He was overloaded. 158 rounds total between both weapons. Too much weight for a paratrooper. But he wanted options. Company Commander, Captain Robert Jensen, walked down the formation line, inspected each man's equipment, checked parachutes, reserve chutes, weapons, ammunition loads. Jensen stopped in front of Kovac, looked at the M1 Carbine. "That weapon serviceable, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir." "Magazines functional?" "Yes, sir. Tested yesterday on the range." Jensen nodded, moved to the next man. He didn't examine the magazines closely, didn't ask about modifications. Either he didn't know or didn't want to know. Kovac suspected the latter. Battalion briefing at 0800 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Willard Harrison, battalion commander, stood in front of a large map of Holland. Drop zones marked in red. Objectives marked in blue. German positions marked in black. 82nd Airborne drops near Grosbeek, Harrison said. Our objectives include bridges at Grave and Nijmegen, plus high ground east of Grosbeek. Intelligence estimates light German resistance, mostly garrison troops. Second-rate infantry. We should secure objectives within 24 hours. Intelligence was wrong, but nobody knew that yet. The actual German forces near Arnhem included elements of 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions, combat veterans, well-equipped, experienced, not garrison troops. But intelligence said light resistance, so that's what everyone prepared for. Harrison continued the briefing. Drop altitude 800 feet. Drop time 1400 hours. Flight time from England approximately 2 hours 15 minutes. Expect flak over the drop zone, Harrison said. Germans know we're coming. They'll have 88s positioned to cover likely drop zones. Stay tight in the door. Fast exit. Don't bunch up on the ground. Standard jump procedures. Nothing unusual. Kovac listened with half his attention. The other half was thinking about his modified magazines, wondering if they'd work as well in combat as they had on the range. Wondering if he'd just committed a court-martial offense that would save lives or get men killed. No way to know, until the shooting started. Briefing ended at 0900 hours. Kovac gathered his squad. 9 men sitting in a rough circle on the ground outside the barracks. "Equipment check," Kovac said. "Everyone verify ammunition counts, weapon function, parachute connections." The men checked their gear. Walsh test-fired his bar on a clearing barrel. Chen verified his Garand's N-block clips. Sullivan counted bar magazines. Mitchell sat next to Kovac, both men carrying M1 Carbines, both using modified magazines. "You think it'll work?" Mitchell asked quietly. "It worked on the range," Kovac said. "Range isn't combat." "No, it's not." Mitchell nodded. Didn't say anything else. Both men understood the risk. If the modifications failed during combat, men would die. If the modifications worked, men would survive. Simple equation, binary outcome. They'd know which outcome in approximately 6 hours. Kovac looked at his squad. 9 men, good soldiers, professional, trained. They deserved weapons that worked when they pulled the trigger. Morrison hadn't gotten that. Morrison got a weapon that clicked when he needed it to fire. Kovac wasn't going to let that happen again. Not to his squad. Not if doubled magazine springs could prevent it. At 1100 hours, 1st Battalion loaded onto C-47 transport aircraft. 17 paratroopers per aircraft. Kovac's squad split between 2 planes. Kovac sat near the door of the lead aircraft. Watched England disappear below. Watched the English Channel pass beneath. Watched the Dutch coast appear. He pulled out one of his modified magazines. Examined it one more time. The floor plate was slightly bulged from the pressure of 2 springs. Anyone looking closely would notice. But nobody was looking closely. The magazine held 15 rounds, 2. Springs provided 18 pounds of feed pressure. It had worked on the range. It would work in combat. It had to work. Because in 90 minutes, Kovac would be on the ground in Holland, and Germans would be shooting at him, and his weapon would either fire or it wouldn't. Morrison's weapon hadn't fired. Kovac's weapon would. He put the magazine back in his pouch, checked his main parachute connections, checked his reserve, looked at the other paratroopers in the aircraft. Some were nervous. First combat jump, others were calm. Veterans from Normandy and Sicily. All of them carried weapons. Some would work reliably, some wouldn't. The difference between working and not working was often 5 pounds of spring tension and a soldier willing to break regulations to keep his men alive. The C-47 crossed the Dutch coast at 1300 hours. German flak opened up immediately. Black bursts of 88mm fire. The aircraft shuddered. Kovac watched the red light above the door. Thought about Morrison. Thought about 47 magazine failures. Thought about doubled springs and unauthorized modifications and the fact that he was about to find out if breaking the rules was worth it. The light turned green. Kovac hit the Dutch beat field at 1407 minutes, 17 seconds. He rolled with the impact, muscle memory from 23 previous training jumps and 2 combat drops. Normandy, and now Holland. The parachute collapsed behind him. German small arms fire snapped overhead from the tree line 300 yards east. 8 seconds to shed the harness. Kovac popped the quick releases, shrugged out of the straps, grabbed his M1 Carbine. The weapon had survived the jump secured across his reserve parachute. He pulled the charging handle, chambered a round from the first modified magazine. Muzzle flashes in the tree line. German infantry. Squad strength at minimum, maybe more. Kovac dropped prone behind a shallow furrow in the beat field. Aimed at the muzzle flashes. Fired 3 rounds. The carbine functioned perfectly. Bolt cycled. Empty casings ejected. Next rounds fed smoothly from the magazine despite the hard landing, despite the dirt already coating the weapon. He fired another 3-round burst. Another. The modified magazine spring pushed cartridges into the chamber with 18 pounds of pressure. More than enough to overcome the field debris. Other paratroopers landed around him, some in the open field, some beyond the tree line. One paratrooper hit 70 yards to Kovac's left, tangled in his parachute suspension lines, struggling to get free. German fire shifted toward the tangled paratrooper. Kovac fired 6 rounds rapid, suppressive fire, forced the Germans to take cover. The tangled paratrooper cut himself free, rolled into a drainage ditch. Kovac's first magazine ran dry after 15 rounds. He dropped it, inserted the second modified magazine. 2 seconds. Faster than an M1 Garand reload. Continued firing. The weapon fed every round. No hesitation, no clicks, no failures. 12 more rounds expended. Movement to Kovac's right. Corporal Mitchell landed 50 yards away, shed his parachute, unslung his M1 Carbine, also using modified magazines. Mitchell ran toward Kovac's position in a low crouch. German fire followed him. Mitchell dove into the furrow next to Kovac. "Tree line?" Mitchell asked. "Squad strength. Maybe more. MG-42 somewhere in there." Mitchell nodded, aimed his carbine, fired 5 rounds. His modified magazines fed perfectly despite the running approach and diving impact into the dirt. The German MG-42 opened up. Distinctive sound. 1,200 rounds per minute. The bullets tore through the beat field, throwing up dirt and plant matter. Kovac and Mitchell pressed flat. "We need to move," Mitchell said. "Drainage ditch, 30 yards left." They moved together. Fire and movement. Mitchell fired suppressive bursts while Kovac ran. Then Kovac fired while Mitchell ran. Standard tactics. Both men's carbines functioning flawlessly. They reached the drainage ditch. 4 other paratroopers already there. Private Chen with his M1 Garand. Private Walsh with his BR. 2 men from 2nd Squad, both carrying Garands. "Anyone hit?" Kovac asked. Chen shook his head. "All good, Sergeant." Walsh pointed toward the tree line. MG-42's in that position, maybe 250 yards. Can't get a clear shot. More paratroopers landing in the field. 17 total from Kovac's aircraft. The C-47 had already turned away, heading back toward England. Other aircraft were dropping their sticks. The sky filled with parachutes. German fire intensified. They were shooting at the paratroopers still in the air. A paratrooper from 3rd Squad took rounds through the leg during descent. Kovac watched him land hard, not moving. "We need to suppress that MG-42, Kovac said. "Walsh, can you reach it with the bar?" "Barely. It's at the edge of my effective range." "Do it anyway. Keep their heads down." Walsh positioned the bar on the edge of the drainage ditch. Fired sustained bursts. 20 rounds per magazine. The heavy .30-06 rounds hammered toward the tree line. The German MG-42 stopped firing. Temporarily. They were repositioning or reloading. Kovac used the pause. "Chen, Sullivan, move right 50 yards. Flank that position when I give the signal. Mitchell, you're with me. We'll move left. Walsh stays here, provides suppressive fire." The men moved into position. Kovac and Mitchell crawled left along the drainage ditch. Reached a point where the ditch curved toward the tree line. Good approach angle. They could get within 100 yards before the Germans had a clear shot. Kovac keyed his throat microphone. 5th Battalion used SCR-300 radio sets, but squad leaders had short-range throat mics for immediate coordination. "Chen, you in position?" "Affirmative, Sergeant." "On my mark, assault the tree line. Walsh provides cover fire," Kovac looked at Mitchell. Both men checked their magazines. Kovac had 13 rounds remaining in his second magazine. Mitchell had 11 in his first. "Execute," Kovac said. Walsh opened up with the bar. Long sustained burst, 40 rounds. The tree line erupted with impacts. Kovac and Mitchell ran toward the German position from the left. Chen and Sullivan ran from the right. 50 yards, 40, 30. German infantry appeared at the tree line. 5 men. Not the MG-42 crew. Riflemen. They'd been waiting for the Americans to assault. Kovac fired on the move. 3 round bursts. His modified magazine fed perfectly despite the running gait, despite his weapon bouncing with each step. The doubled springs maintained consistent feeding pressure. 1 German fell. Another took cover. Mitchell fired beside him. 6 rounds rapid. Another German down. 20 yards from the tree line. Kovac's second magazine ran dry. He dropped it without breaking stride, inserted his third modified magazine while still running. The reload took 3 seconds. Muscle memory. He'd practiced it 500 times, brought the carbine back up, fired immediately. The fresh magazine fed the first round perfectly, 10 yards. The remaining Germans broke and ran, fell back deeper into the tree line. The MG-42 crew abandoned their position. Kovac reached the tree line, found the MG-42 still sitting on its tripod. The Germans had left it. Chen and Sullivan arrived from the right, both breathing hard. "Tree line secure," Chen reported. Kovac nodded, checked his ammunition. Third magazine, 12 rounds remaining. 3 full magazines left in his pouches, 67 rounds total. The firefight had lasted 8 minutes. Kovac had expended 43 rounds, 0 malfunctions across 3 magazine changes under combat conditions. Running, diving, dirt everywhere. The modified magazines had performed exactly as tested. Mitchell had similar results. 40 rounds fired, 0 malfunctions. Behind them, more paratroopers were landing and forming up. 1st Battalion was consolidating on the drop zone. Some squads had taken casualties. 1 C-47 had been hit by flak and scattered its stick across 2 miles. But Kovac's squad was intact. 9 men accounted for, all functional, all armed, ready to continue the mission. The modified magazines had worked. Morrison's death hadn't been repeated. Not today. Not in Kovac's squad. September 17th, 1944, 1630 hours. 1st Battalion regrouped at the rally point 1 kilometer south of the drop zone. Approximately 300 paratroopers. Some squads under strength from jump casualties. Some overstrength from men who'd landed far from their units and attached to the nearest formation. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison established a command post in a Dutch farmhouse. Called his company commanders together. Issued orders. "Intelligence was wrong," Harrison said. "We're facing more than garrison troops. Radio intercepts indicate SS elements in the area, probably from 9th or 10th Panzer Division." The company commanders exchanged looks. SS Panzer troops were frontline combat veterans, not the second-rate garrison forces intelligence had promised. "Our objectives remain unchanged," Harrison continued. 1st Battalion secures the high ground east of Grosbeek. 2nd Battalion takes the bridge at Grave. 3rd Battalion remains in reserve. He pointed to the map. "There's a farmhouse complex here, 1 kilometer south. Good defensive terrain. We'll establish a blocking position to prevent German counterattacks from the east. Move out in 15 minutes." The company commanders dispersed. Captain Jensen found Kovac. "Your squad leads the advance," Jensen said. "Scout the farmhouse. Report enemy strength. If it's clear, we'll occupy it. If it's defended, we'll develop the situation." "Understood, sir." Kovac gathered his squad, briefed them on the mission. 9 men would approach the farmhouse complex. Standard patrol formation. Kovac on point with Mitchell, Chen and Walsh providing overwatch, Sullivan and the others in support positions. They moved out at 1645 hours. The Dutch countryside was flat, open fields, scattered tree lines, few covered approaches, not ideal for infantry movement, but necessary. The farmhouse appeared after 20 minutes of movement. Two-story structure, stone construction, barn attached to the east side, good fields of fire in all directions. Kovac halted the squad 200 yards out, studied the farmhouse through his field glasses, movement in the upper windows. German infantry, at least 6 men visible, probably more inside. Occupied, Kovac reported over the radio. Estimated squad strength minimum. Jensen's voice crackled back. Can you take it? Kovac assessed. 9 Americans versus at least 6 Germans in a fortified position. Not great odds. But the farmhouse was critical terrain. Whoever held it controlled the approaches to Grosbeek. We can take it, Kovac said. He positioned his squad. Walsh and the bar on the left flank. Chen with the Garand on the right. Mitchell and 3 riflemen would assault from the south. Kovac would lead. Walsh, suppressive fire on the upper windows. Keep them pinned. Chen, watch for flanking movement from the barn. Everyone else, on me when I move. Kovac checked his carbine. 3rd magazine, 12 rounds remaining. He swapped it for a fresh magazine, 15 rounds. Wanted maximum ammunition for the assault. The modified magazine seated with a solid click. The doubled springs kept the follower under high tension. Ready? Execute, Kovac said. Walsh opened fire. The bar hammered the farmhouse upper windows. 20 rounds, glass shattered. Stone chips flew. Kovac ran toward the farmhouse, Mitchell beside him. 3 riflemen following. 150 yards, 100. German fire erupted from the ground floor windows. Rifles and submachine guns. MP-40s, 9mm rounds, snapped past Kovac's head. He fired on the move. 3 round bursts at the muzzle flashes. His modified magazine fed perfectly despite the sprint, despite his weapon bouncing with each running step. The 18-pound spring pressure kept rounds feeding consistently. 75 yards. A German appeared in the doorway, aimed a Kar 98K rifle, fired. The round missed Kovac by inches. Kovac put 3 rounds into the doorway. The German fell back inside. 50 yards. Mitchell fired beside him. Sustained burst, 8 rounds. His modified carbine functioned flawlessly. 30 yards. Kovac's magazine ran dry. He dropped it, reached for his 5th magazine, inserted it while still running. The reload took 4 seconds, longer than the 3-second standing reload, but acceptable under combat conditions. 20 yards. Germans appeared at 2 ground floor windows, both armed with MP-40 submachine guns. They opened fire simultaneously. Kovac dove left. Mitchell dove right. Bullets tore through the space they'd just occupied. Kovac hit the ground, rolled, came up firing. 6 rounds at the left window. The German submachine gunner fell backward. Mitchell engaged the right window. 5 rounds. That German also went down. 10 yards. Kovac reached the farmhouse wall, pressed against the stone, breathing hard. Mitchell arrived 3 seconds later. The 3 riflemen reached the wall, all intact. No casualties during the assault. Walsh continued suppressive fire from 200 yards out. Chen watched the barn for flanking movement. Kovac pulled a fragmentation grenade from his web gear. Mitchell did the same. "Frag the ground floor," Kovac said. "Then we go in." Both men pulled pins, threw grenades through the shattered windows. 4 seconds of fuse time. The grenades detonated. Dual explosions. Smoke and debris burst from the windows. Kovac went through the door, carbine up, scanning for targets. 2 Germans down from the grenades, 1 still moving. Kovac fired twice. The German stopped moving. Mitchell entered behind him, cleared the right side of the room. "Clear." Voices upstairs. German, shouting. Footsteps on the wooden stairs. Kovac aimed at the stairway. A German appeared, descending rapidly. Kovac fired 4 rounds. The German tumbled down the stairs. Another German at the top of the stairs. He threw a stick grenade down toward Kovac and Mitchell. Both men dove away from the stairway. The grenade exploded. Concussive blast. Shrapnel embedded in the walls. Kovac's ears rang. He shook his head. Focused. Stood. The stairway was partially collapsed from the explosion. Movement in the room above. At least 2 Germans remaining. "Sullivan," Kovac called. "Bring the riflemen inside. Clear the ground floor. Mitchell and I are going upstairs." Sullivan and the 3 riflemen entered. Began systematically clearing the ground floor rooms. Kovac climbed the damaged stairway. The wood creaked under his weight. Mitchell followed. Second floor hallway. 3 doors. All closed. Kovac approached the first door, listened, heard movement inside. He fired 6 rounds through the door. Splintered wood, heard a scream. Mitchell kicked the door open. Kovac entered. 1 German down, wounded. Another German by the window, rifle aimed at the door. The German fired. Missed. Bolt action. He needed to cycle the bolt for another shot. Kovac fired first. 3 rounds. The German fell. Kovac's magazine ran dry, his 5th magazine. 15 rounds expended in less than 30 seconds of close-quarters combat. He dropped the empty magazine, reached for his 6th and final modified magazine. This was the critical moment. The moment when magazine spring tension mattered most. Kovac's hands were covered in dirt and stone dust from the grenade explosions. His weapon was filthy. Carbon buildup from 70 rounds of firing. Debris in the chamber. He inserted the 6th magazine, chambered a round. The bolt slid forward smoothly. The doubled springs pushed the cartridge into the chamber despite all the contamination. 18 pounds of pressure overcoming everything that should have caused a malfunction. The weapon was ready. Mitchell cleared the other 2 rooms, both empty. The Germans had abandoned them. "Second floor clear," Mitchell reported. Kovac moved to the window, looked out over the fields, saw approximately 50 German infantry moving through the fields from the northeast. Not a squad, a full platoon, maybe more. They'd seen the assault on the farmhouse. Now they were counterattacking to retake it. Kovac keyed his radio. "Captain Jensen, we've secured the farmhouse, but we've got company. Approximately 50 Germans approaching from the northeast, range 400 yards and closing." Jensen's response was immediate. "Hold that position. Reinforcements moving to you now. ETA 10 minutes. Kovac looked at Mitchell. 9 Americans in the farmhouse, 50 Germans approaching. 10 minutes until reinforcements arrived. The math didn't work unless the Americans could generate enough firepower to keep the Germans suppressed. Kovac checked his ammunition. 6th magazine in his weapon, 15 rounds. No other carbine magazines remaining, but he still had his backup M1 Garand. 48 rounds, 30.06 in 6-in-block clips. He unslung the Garand. Heavy, 11 pounds loaded, but reliable, and he'd need every round. Mitchell had 2 modified magazines remaining, 30 rounds. Walsh had the bar, approximately 200 rounds remaining across multiple magazines. Chen and the other riflemen had their Garands. Combined, maybe 200 rounds, 30.06. Total American firepower, approximately 500 rounds across 9 men. Against 50 Germans who had reached the farmhouse in less than 3 minutes. Kovac positioned his men, Walsh and the bar in the second-floor window with the best field of fire. Chen and 2 riflemen on the ground floor, covering the south and west approaches. Mitchell in a second-floor window covering the north. Sullivan and 1 rifleman holding the barn to prevent Germans from flanking. "Conserve ammunition," Kovac ordered. "Aimed shots, make them count. We need to hold for 10 minutes. The Germans advanced in textbook formation, fire and movement. squads leapfrogging, professional, experienced. These were SS troops. They knew what they were doing. 300 yards, 250. Walsh opened fire. The bar's heavy .30-06 rounds reached out across the fields. Kovac saw one German fall, another took cover. The German advance slowed. They were taking the farmhouse seriously now, deploying into assault formation, 200 yards. Chen fired from the ground floor, 8 rounds from his Garand. The distinctive ping as the empty en-bloc clip ejected. He reloaded, continued firing. The other riflemen joined in. Sustained fire. The Germans went to ground, used the scattered trees and drainage ditches for cover, 150 yards. The Germans returned fire. Concentrated volleys, rifle rounds and machine gun fire hammered the farmhouse. Stone chips flew from impacts, windows shattered. Kovac fired his Garand, 8 rounds at a German squad trying to flank from the west. Saw 2 Germans fall, reloaded. Mitchell used his M1 Carbine from the north window. The modified magazines fed perfectly despite the sustained firing. He emptied one magazine, reloaded his final magazine, continued engaging targets. 100 yards. The Germans rushed the farmhouse, not the entire platoon. 1 squad, 12 men. They rose from cover and ran toward the south wall. "South wall!" Kovac shouted. Chen and the ground floor riflemen concentrated fire on the rushing Germans, Garands hammering. The Germans took casualties. 4 fell, 3 more wounded. The rest went to ground. The assault stalled. But the Germans were learning. They'd probed the defenses, found where the Americans were concentrated. Now they'd adjust. Kovac checked his watch. 6 minutes since he'd called for reinforcements. 4 minutes remaining. His Garand was down to 16 rounds. 2 en-bloc clips. Mitchell's final carbine magazine was half empty. Walsh had maybe 100 bar rounds left. The Germans prepared for another assault, this time from multiple directions simultaneously. Kovacs knew what was coming. Coordinated attack. Overwhelming force. The 9 Americans couldn't hold against that, unless the reinforcements arrived in the next 90 seconds. The German assault came at 1700 hours. 50 infantry attacking from 3 directions simultaneously. North, south, and east. Textbook coordination. The kind of tactics that won battles through overwhelming force applied at multiple points. Kovac fired his Garand from the second-floor window. 8 rounds into the mass of Germans advancing from the east. Reloaded his last unblocked clip, 8 more rounds. Then his Garand was dry. He dropped the empty rifle, grabbed his M1 Carbine. 6th magazine still loaded. 15 rounds remaining. The Germans reached 50 yards from the farmhouse, close enough that Kovac could see individual faces. Young men, determined, professional soldiers doing their job. He fired controlled bursts, 3 rounds, 3 rounds, 3 rounds. The modified magazine fed perfectly. Every round chambered despite the weapon being filthy from 90 minutes of sustained combat. Mitchell's carbine ran dry. He switched to his backup Garand, continued firing. Walsh hammered away with the bar. Long bursts now, no ammunition conservation, just maximum firepower to break the assault. The Germans faltered at 30 yards. Too many casualties, too much fire from the farmhouse. They went to ground, returned fire from prone positions. Kovac's carbine magazine ran empty. His 6th and final modified magazine. He'd expended all 90 rounds of .30 carbine ammunition. He dropped the carbine, drew his M1911 pistol. 7 rounds, 45 ACP, close-range weapon. He'd use it if the Germans reached the farmhouse walls. 25 yards. The Germans prepared to rush the final distance. Then Kovac heard the most beautiful sound in the world. The roar of multiple bar automatic rifles opening fire from the tree line 200 yards west. American reinforcements. 1st Battalion's Reserve Company. They'd arrived exactly on time. The Germans, caught in the open between the farmhouse and the tree line, took concentrated fire from 2 directions. Devastating crossfire. They broke, retreated, left their casualties in the fields. The firefight ended at 1712 hours. Kovac stood in the farmhouse window, watched the Germans withdraw to the northeast, counted the bodies in the fields. 18 German casualties visible. Maybe more wounded who'd been carried away. American casualties. 2 wounded from Kovac's original squad. Both walking wounded. Superficial wounds from stone fragments. 0 killed. 9 Americans had held a farmhouse against 50 Germans for 12 minutes. Long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Long enough to secure the position. Captain Jensen entered the farmhouse 20 minutes later, surveyed the damage, counted the German dead. "Good work, Sergeant," Jensen said. "Battalion commander wants a detailed after-action report, especially regarding ammunition expenditure and weapons performance." Kovac nodded. "My carbine performed flawlessly, sir. 90 rounds fired, 0 malfunctions." Jensen looked at the M1 Carbine Kovac was holding, noticed it was exceptionally dirty, carbon fouled, covered in stone dust and debris. "That weapon should have jammed," Jensen said.